The footman called her name too loudly, and every head at the long table turned before Eleanor Whitmore had even crossed the threshold of the dining hall. She stopped for a moment, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes, then walked forward with her chin steady and her hands calm at her sides. She had practiced this walk for days. She would not let anyone see her falter. The hall at Ashford Estate glowed with candlelight, gold plates catching the flame, crystal glasses lined up like soldiers waiting for orders. Eleanor had been invited by a distant cousin, Margaret Ellison, who had promised her a quiet seat near the middle of the table, far from notice, far from judgment. It was meant to be a small mercy, a place to sit, to eat, to disappear into the noise of polite conversation, without anyone asking too many questions about who she was, or where her money had gone. But mercy was not something the Duke of Ashford dealt in. Edmund Ashford stood near the head of the table, tall and unreadable, dressed in black that made him look carved from the shadows of his own home. He held a glass of wine he had not yet tasted, and his eyes moved over the room the way a merchant studies goods before deciding what to purchase and what to discard. When his gaze landed on Eleanor, something in his expression sharpened. "Who arranged this seating?" he asked, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation like a blade through silk. The butler, an older man named Nathaniel, stepped forward with his hands folded. "Miss Whitmore was placed by Lady Ellison's request, Your Grace." Whitmore. Edmund repeated the name as though testing its weight and finding it wanting. The family that lost their land 3 years ago, the father who could not pay his debts. A ripple moved through the room. Eleanor felt her face grow warm, but she did not look away from him. She had heard worse said about her family in worse rooms. She had learned, slowly and painfully, how to keep her expression still even when her chest burned. "That family," Edmund said, setting down his glass without breaking his stare, "does not sit among gentlemen and ladies of standing in my home." Margaret rose halfway from her chair. "Edmund, please, she is my guest." "Then your guest may sit where guests without fortune are seated," he said, and he gestured, almost lazily, toward the far end of the hall, past the polished silver and the seated nobility, to a narrow table near the kitchen doors where the household staff took their meals between service. "There is a place for her there." The room went utterly silent. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor felt something cold settle into her stomach, a feeling far worse than embarrassment. It was the particular sting of being seen, truly seen, and dismissed in the same breath. She thought of her father, of the quiet dignity he had carried even as everything was taken from him, and she thought of the promise she had made herself after his passing, that she would never again beg for a place at anyone's table. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply inclined her head, the smallest gesture of acknowledgement, and said, "As you wish, Your Grace." Her voice did not shake. That, she would remember later, was the only victory she managed that evening. She walked the length of the hall alone, past faces that turned away rather than meet her eyes, past a young man named Oliver Bellamy who half rose from his seat as if to object, then sat back down when his mother's hand closed over his wrist. She walked past Margaret, whose face had gone pale with horror and helpless apology. She walked past the long mirror on the far wall and caught, for one unguarded second, her own reflection, a woman in a borrowed blue dress, spine straight, eyes dry, moving toward a servant's table as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She sat. The staff at the table shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to make room for her or pretend she was not there. An older woman, a cook named Beatrice, quietly slid a plate toward her without a word, her eyes soft with something like pity. Eleanor did not eat. She could not have, even if she tried. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened to the muffled sounds of the feast continuing without her. The polite laughter, the clink of glasses, the low murmur of gossip that she knew, without needing to hear the words, was about her. A young footman named Henry passed close by, balancing a tray of empty dishes, and gave her a quick, sympathetic glance before disappearing through the kitchen doors. Even among the staff there was an awareness that something had gone wrong tonight, that a line had been crossed which even they, who lived their whole lives within such lines, understood should not have been crossed so carelessly. Eleanor thought of the letter in her small bag, the one from a lawyer in London that she had not yet opened, the one she had been too afraid to read before tonight because she feared what it might say about the last of her father's affairs. She thought of the years before his passing, when Ashford Estate and her family's own house at Belmont had stood as equals, when the Whitmores had dined at tables just as fine as this one, when no one would have dreamed of questioning where she sat. Fortune, she understood now with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, was a fragile and cruel thing. It could vanish in the span of a single bad harvest, A single failed investment, a single unpaid debt called due at the worst possible moment. And when it vanished, it took with it every kindness that had once seemed so permanent, every friend who had once seemed so loyal. She glanced once toward the head table, toward Edmund Ashford, who was speaking to a gentleman on his left as though the evening had returned entirely to normal. She studied his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the careless confidence of a man who had never once in his life had to wonder where he belonged. She felt no anger toward him in that moment, only a strange and distant curiosity, as though she were observing a stranger through glass. He did not know her. He had judged her by a name and a rumor, and in doing so, he had told her everything she needed to know about him. Beatrice leaned close and murmured, so quietly that only Eleanor could hear, "You held yourself well, miss, better than most would have." "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, and meant it. It was the only true kindness offered to her all evening, and she would remember it long after she had forgotten the taste of humiliation that had accompanied it. At the head table, Edmund Ashford resumed his meal as though nothing of consequence had happened, but something had shifted in him too, though he would not have admitted it. He found his attention drifting, again and again, toward the far end of the hall, toward the woman sitting perfectly straight among the servants, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Charlotte, leaned toward him with a look of quiet disapproval. "That was unnecessary, Edmund." "It was appropriate," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Appropriate." Charlotte repeated the word with a small, humorless laugh. "You know nothing of that family beyond rumor and debt collectors' gossip. You have made an enemy tonight, and you do not even know her name beyond the one that displeases you." Edmund did not answer. He told himself the matter was settled, that a woman of no fortune and no standing could hardly matter beyond the discomfort of the evening. But the feeling in his chest, something between irritation and unease, refused to leave him. The meal wore on. Course after course arrived and was cleared. Conversation returned to its usual rhythms, though quieter than before, as though the room itself was still recovering from what it had witnessed. Servants moved back and forth from the kitchen, and each time the doors swung open, Edmund found his eyes drawn to the servants' table, half expecting, half dreading, to see Eleanor Whitmore still sitting there with that same unbroken composure. When dessert was announced, a delicate arrangement of spiced pears and cream, Edmund allowed himself to glance toward her one final time, telling himself it meant nothing, that he was simply confirming the evening's small cruelty had run its course. The table was empty. Not empty of staff, not empty of the plates Beatrice had set out, empty of Eleanor. He frowned, scanning the hall, expecting to find her near the doorway, perhaps stepped out for air, perhaps retreating to compose herself after the humiliation he had delivered so freely. But she was nowhere, not near the windows, not near the hearth, not among the small clusters of guests murmuring by the wine table. Margaret rose from her seat, her voice tight with concern. "Where is Eleanor?" No one answered. The servants exchanged uncertain glances. Beatrice, when questioned, could only say that she had turned away to fetch more bread, and when she looked back, the seat beside her was empty, the chair pushed in neatly, as though no one had ever sat there at all. Edmund stood without quite deciding to. Something in the stillness of that abandoned chair unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, a small crack of doubt spreading beneath the surface of his certainty. He told himself she had simply left in embarrassment, that she had gone to find a carriage home, humiliated beyond bearing and unwilling to stay another moment in his house. But some part of him, some quiet and unwelcome part, understood that this was not an ending. It was only the beginning of something he had set into motion without meaning to, and by the time the candles burned low and the guests began to whisper among themselves about the strange and sudden disappearance of the woman he had cast aside, Edmund Ashford was already beginning to understand that he had made a mistake he did not yet know how to measure. Outside, the night had turned cold, and somewhere beyond the estate's high iron gates, Eleanor Whitmore walked alone into the darkness, her borrowed blue dress catching moonlight, her decision already made long before dessert had ever reached the table. She did not look back at the glowing windows of Ashford Estate. She had given that house one evening of her dignity. She would not give it another. Behind her, the great house continued to burn with light and laughter, unaware that the woman it had cast to its lowest table had already begun to walk toward a reckoning none of them could yet imagine. The empty chair was the first thing anyone noticed, and within minutes, it had become the only thing anyone could speak of. Margaret Ellison moved through the hall calling Eleanor's name in a voice growing more frantic with each unanswered call, her silk skirts sweeping past confused guests who had no idea what had happened or why the evening had suddenly turned to chaos. Edmund stood near the head table, watching the search unfold with a tightness in his chest he did not fully understand. He told himself repeatedly that this was not his concern, that a woman leaving a dinner she had been humiliated at was hardly a mystery requiring his attention. And yet his feet carried him toward the servants' entrance before he had consciously decided to move. "When did you last see her?" he asked Beatrice, his voice sharper than he intended. The old cook straightened, unbothered by his tone. "I turned to fetch bread, Your Grace. When I looked back, she was gone. No sound, no word to anyone, just gone. Did she take anything? A cloak? A bag?" Beatrice shook her head slowly. "Her bag, yes. It was beside her the whole evening, but her cloak still hangs by the servants' door, Your Grace. She left in the cold without it." Something about that detail unsettled Edmund more than he expected. A woman fleeing embarrassment might forget many things, but leaving warmth behind on a cold night felt less like flight and more like a decision made with terrible clarity, the kind of decision a person makes when comfort no longer matters to them. He walked out through the servants' entrance himself, ignoring the surprised looks of the staff, and stood in the courtyard where the night air bit sharply at his skin. The estate's iron gates stood open, as they always did during a gathering, and beyond them, the road stretched dark and empty toward the village. There was no sign of a carriage having been called, no sign of footprints leading anywhere definite. It was as though she had simply dissolved into the darkness the moment she stepped beyond his walls. "Your Grace." Nathaniel the butler approached carefully, holding a lantern. "Shall I send riders to search the road?" Edmund considered this for a long moment. Sending riders after a departed guest, particularly one he himself had humiliated in front of the entire household, would only invite more gossip, more questions about his judgment, more whispered conversations behind gloved hands. And yet the alternative, doing nothing while a woman wandered alone into a cold and unfamiliar night, sat even less comfortably with him. "Send 2 men toward the village," he said finally, quietly. "I want no announcement made of this." Nathaniel nodded and disappeared to arrange it, leaving Edmund alone in the courtyard with his thoughts, which had grown considerably less certain than they had been an hour before. Inside, the gathering had fractured into small, anxious clusters of conversation. Oliver Bellamy, the young man who had half risen from his seat earlier in silent protest, now stood near the window with his mother, speaking in low, urgent tones. "You should not have let it happen," Oliver said, not quite quietly enough. "Whatever her family's circumstances, she did not deserve to be treated so." "It is not our place to correct the Duke's decisions," his mother replied, though her own expression carried little conviction. "Then whose place is it?" Oliver asked, and turned away before she could answer, his jaw set with the particular frustration of a young man who has watched an injustice unfold and found himself powerless to stop it. Margaret, meanwhile, had retreated to a quiet corner near the library, her face pale and her hands trembling as she pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. She blamed herself entirely. She had promised Eleanor a safe evening, a quiet corner of society, where old wounds would not be reopened, and instead she had delivered her cousin directly into the path of the very humiliation Eleanor had spent 3 years trying to escape. It was in the library that Edmund found her a short while later, having returned from the courtyard with no news and no comfort to offer anyone. "I want to know everything about her family," he said without preamble. Margaret looked up at him with something close to disbelief. "Now you wish to know? After you have already decided who she is and cast her aside for it?" "I made a decision based on incomplete information," Edmund said, though the words felt strange and uncomfortable in his mouth, an admission he had rarely had cause to make in his life. "I would like to correct that." "You cannot correct humiliation, Edmund. You can only apologize for it, and even then, only if the person is willing to hear it." Margaret wiped her eyes and drew a steadying breath. "Eleanor's father was Charles Whitmore. You may not remember him, you were young when it happened, but he was once a respected magistrate, a man whose judgment was sought by families far grander than mine. Her mother came from a family with old ties to the northern counties, ties that still carry weight in certain circles even now." Edmund frowned. Then how did they come to lose everything? An investment gone wrong, a partner who deceived him. It happens to honest men more often than dishonest ones, because honest men do not think to guard themselves against betrayal. Margaret's voice hardened. Charles Whitmore spent the last years of his life trying to repay debts that were never truly his to repay, and it broke him long before it broke the family's fortune. Eleanor watched all of it happen. She held that family together with nothing but her own will after he passed, and she has spent every day since fending off exactly the kind of judgment you delivered so easily tonight. Edmund said nothing for a long moment, the weight of Margaret's words settling over him slowly. like snow accumulating on a still night, imperceptible, until suddenly the ground beneath him felt entirely different than it had before. "There is something else," Margaret added quietly, almost reluctantly. "Eleanor's mother's family, the Fairweathers of the North, are not without influence. Her uncle sits close to men who advise Parliament on matters of estate and inheritance law. It is not a connection Eleanor has ever used, because she is too proud to ask for help from relations who turned away from her family when the money disappeared. But it is a connection that exists nonetheless, and if word of tonight reaches the wrong ears in the wrong drawing room, you may find this evening's cruelty repaid in ways you did not anticipate." Edmund absorbed this in silence, and for the first time since the dinner began, something like genuine concern crept into his expression, distinct from the wounded pride he had felt when Margaret first confronted him. The two riders returned near midnight, having found no trace of Eleanor along the village road. No carriage driver recalled carrying a woman matching her description. No innkeeper had seen her pass. It was as though the night itself had folded around her and carried her away to somewhere beyond the reach of Ashford's search. Edmund did not sleep that night. He sat in his study long after the last guests had departed, staring at the dying embers of the fire, turning Margaret's words over in his mind again and again. He thought of the way Eleanor had walked the length of the hall without argument, without a single tear shed where he could see it, her spine straight and her dignity intact even as he stripped away every comfort the evening might have offered her. He had believed in that moment that he was asserting the proper order of things, the natural boundaries between families of standing and families who had lost their place in the world. Now, alone with the silence of his own house, he began to suspect that he had not asserted anything at all. He had simply revealed to a room full of witnesses exactly the kind of man he truly was. Near dawn, a servant brought him a small folded note that had been found tucked beneath the cushion of the chair Eleanor had occupied at the servants' table, discovered only when the staff cleared the hall for the night. Edmund unfolded it with unsteady hands, half expecting an accusation, a final word of anger directed at him before she vanished entirely from his life. Instead, the note contained only a single line, written in a careful, steady hand that betrayed no trace of the humiliation she must have felt while writing it. "You will not see me until you understand what you have done." Edmund read the line 3 times, then folded the note carefully and placed it inside his coat, close to his chest, as though it were something worth protecting. Far from Ashford Estate, Eleanor had walked nearly 2 miles before a farmer's cart, driven by a kind stranger named Walter who asked no questions about a woman traveling alone at night, carried her the rest of the way toward the Crossroads Inn where she had arranged, weeks earlier and almost without daring to hope she would need it, a small room under a false sense of caution. She had known, somewhere in the quiet part of her mind that always prepared for the worst, that an evening at Ashford Estate might end badly. She had not expected it to end quite so publicly, but she had prepared regardless, because preparation was the only power left to a woman who had lost everything else. The innkeeper, a soft-spoken widow named Agnes, asked no questions either, only handed her a key and a cup of something warm to drink against the cold. Eleanor sat by the small window of her room for a long while, watching the dark road outside, feeling the last of the evening's humiliation settle into something colder and more useful. She would not cry over Edmund Ashford. She had cried over greater losses than his casual cruelty, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she had no tears left to spend on a man who did not even know her name beyond a rumor. Instead, she took from her bag the letter she had been too afraid to open before the dinner, the one from the London solicitor handling the last unresolved matters of her father's estate. She broke the seal with steady fingers and read it slowly by candlelight. The letter was not what she expected. It did not speak of further debts or further losses, as every letter from London had for the past 3 years. It spoke instead of an old claim, buried in her father's papers and only recently uncovered during a routine review, regarding land and a modest fund held in trust through her mother's family, the Fairweathers, land that had never been part of her father's failed investments and had therefore never been forfeited. The solicitor believed, cautiously and with many careful qualifications, that Eleanor might have a legitimate claim to reclaim both the land and the fund, provided she could establish her identity and lineage before a magistrate in London. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling now for an entirely different reason than the humiliation of the evening before. It was not a fortune, not by the standards of families like the Ashfords, but it was something. It was a foundation. It was, perhaps, the first solid ground she had stood on since her father's passing. She thought of the empty chair she had left behind at Ashford Estate, of the note she had tucked beneath the cushion before slipping out through the servants' door, and she felt something settle inside her that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite anger, but a steady, clear resolve. She would go to London. She would speak with the solicitor. She would reclaim whatever remained of her family's name, not out of vengeance, though she would not pretend the thought of Edmund Ashford's future discomfort held no appeal, but because she deserved, after everything, to stand somewhere in the world on ground that was entirely her own. She folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the note she had already written for the Duke, the one she had left behind deliberately, knowing it would find him eventually. She had meant every word of it. He would not see her again until he understood what he had done, and by the time he did understand, she intended to be a woman he could no longer afford to dismiss. Outside her window, the first gray hint of dawn touched the horizon, and Eleanor Whitmore closed her eyes for the first real rest she had allowed herself in days, knowing that whatever came next, she would meet it standing, not seated at anyone's lesser table ever again. London swallowed her whole, and Eleanor was grateful for it. 3 weeks after the dinner at Ashford Estate, she stood outside the offices of Pratt and Holloway, solicitors, on a narrow street crowded with carriages and hurried clerks, holding her father's old papers against her chest like armor. She had rehearsed what she would say a dozen times during the journey, but standing at the door, all rehearsal fell away, replaced by the simple, urgent need to finally understand what remained of her family's name. Mr. Holloway received her in a small office lined with towers of paper, spectacles perched low on his nose, his manner brisk but not unkind. He listened as she explained who she was, checked her documents against records he retrieved from a locked cabinet, and after nearly an hour of careful, methodical questioning, set down his pen and looked at her with something like genuine respect. "Your claim is sound, Miss Whitmore. More than sound. The Fairweather Trust was established by your grandmother's will in a manner your father's creditors never had legal grounds to touch, though I suspect they never bothered to look closely enough to find it. The land itself, near Belmont, sits at nearly 400 acres, and the fund, while modest by the standards of great estates, is more than sufficient to establish you as a woman of independent means." Eleanor sat very still, absorbing words she had not truly allowed herself to hope for. "How soon can this be settled?" "A matter of months, provided the magistrate confirms your lineage without dispute, which I expect will be a formality given your documentation." Holloway removed his spectacles and studied her for a moment. "May I ask, Miss Whitmore, what prompted you to pursue this now? The letter informing you of the claim was sent some weeks ago, yet you delayed your visit." Eleanor considered how much to say. "I received an education recently, sir, in exactly how little my name has meant to certain people. I decided it was time to change that." Holloway allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "Then I suspect London society is about to become considerably more interesting." Word of Eleanor's claim moved through certain circles faster than she expected, though not through any effort of her own. The Fairweather name still carried weight in the northern counties, and her uncle, Nathaniel Fairweather, a man she had met only twice in her life, arrived at her modest lodgings within a fortnight of the claim being filed, his carriage far grander than anything she could currently afford, his expression a careful mixture of guilt and genuine concern. "I should have done more when your father passed," he admitted, seated stiffly in her small parlor, turning his hat over in his hands. "Family pride kept me from reaching out, and I have regretted it every year since. If you will allow it, I would like to help you now, not out of obligation, but because you are the only family I have left who carries your grandmother's steadiness." Eleanor studied him carefully before answering. She had learned, painfully, not to trust offers of kindness too quickly. But something in his manner, the genuine discomfort of a man confronting his own failure, convinced her he was sincere. "I would welcome your guidance, uncle, but I will not be dependent on it. Whatever I rebuild, I intend to rebuild with my own name attached to it." Nathaniel nodded slowly, respect deepening in his expression. "Your father would be proud to hear you say that." The magistrate's hearing took place on a gray morning in a small courtroom near the Inns of Court, and Eleanor arrived early. Dressed simply but impeccably, her documents organized with the same careful precision Mr. Holloway had taught her to present. She had not expected to feel nervous. She had endured far worse than a room full of officials reviewing paper, or so she told herself, as she waited on a hard wooden bench outside the chamber. The magistrate, an elderly man named Justice Farrow, reviewed her documents with a slow, deliberate thoroughness that tested every ounce of her patience. He asked about her grandmother's will, about the exact wording of the trust, about witnesses who could confirm her lineage beyond the paper record. A distant cousin of her mother's, a woman named Beatrice Fairweather, no relation to the cook at Ashford Estate but sharing the common simplicity of the name, appeared to testify on her behalf. confirming details of the family history that Eleanor herself had only half known. At one point, a clerk representing a creditor from her father's old debts attempted to argue that the trust should be considered part of the estate's forfeited assets, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with a fear she had not expected to resurface. The old dread of losing everything all over again, of standing once more in a room where men decided her fate without asking her opinion of it. But Holloway had prepared for exactly this challenge, presenting the original will with a clarity that left little room for dispute, demonstrating that the trust had been established a full decade before her father's investments failed, entirely separate from any asset later claimed by creditors. Justice Farrow listened, nodded slowly, and after a pause that felt to Eleanor like the longest of her life, ruled in her favor. "The claim of Miss Eleanor Whitmore, née of the Fairweather line, is confirmed," he announced. "The trust and associated lands are to be restored to her name, effective immediately." Eleanor did not cry, though she felt the sting of tears threatening at the edges of her composure. She thanked the magistrate, thanked Holloway, and walked out of the courtroom into the gray London morning feeling, for the first time in 3 years, that the ground beneath her feet was entirely and undeniably her own. Her uncle was waiting outside, and when he saw her expression, he did not need to ask the outcome. He simply embraced her, an unfamiliar gesture between them, and said quietly, "Your father would weep to see this day. I wish he had lived to see it," Eleanor said softly. "He lives in you," Nathaniel replied. "Anyone who watched you in that courtroom would know exactly whose daughter you are." That evening, alone in her lodgings, Eleanor allowed herself, finally, a small and private celebration. She poured a single glass of wine, sat by her window, and read her father's old letters late into the night, letters full of encouragement and quiet wisdom that she had kept through every hardship of the past 3 years. She thought of the servants' table at Ashford Estate, of the cold night walk that had followed it, and she understood now that the humiliation Edmund Ashford had delivered so carelessly had, in its strange and unintended way, set her on the path toward reclaiming everything he assumed she had already lost. Over the following weeks, with her uncle's introductions and her own quiet determination, Eleanor began to re-establish herself within circles that had once known the Whitmore name before it fell into disgrace. She was invited to smaller gatherings first, careful and tentative, hosted by families willing to test the waters of her reputation before committing to anything grander. She conducted herself at each one with the same unshaken composure she had shown at Ashford's servants' table, and slowly, word began to spread that Eleanor Whitmore, far from the disgraced daughter of a failed magistrate, was in fact a woman of remarkable poise and quietly reclaimed fortune. Meanwhile, at Ashford Estate, Edmund found himself unable to settle back into the rhythms of his ordinary life. The note Eleanor had left behind sat in the drawer of his writing desk, and he found himself reading it more often than he would have admitted to anyone, turning her words over and over, searching for some way to undo the harm he had caused. He made inquiries, quietly at first, through contacts in London who owed him favors, and what he learned unsettled him further with each passing week. The Fairweather Trust, the magistrate's hearing, the growing circle of families reopening their doors to a woman he had cast to the servants' table without a second thought. Each piece of information landed like a small, precise blow, dismantling the certainty he had carried into that dinner months ago. His mother, Charlotte, watched his growing preoccupation with a mixture of sympathy and quiet satisfaction. "You are learning at last that the world does not organize itself as neatly as you once believed," she told him one evening as they sat together in the drawing room. "I made an error in judgment," Edmund said stiffly. "It does not require a lecture." "It requires more than acknowledgement, Edmund. It requires action, if you have any hope of correcting it, though I wonder if correction is even what you are seeking, or if something else has taken hold of you these past weeks." Edmund did not answer immediately, because he was not entirely certain of the answer himself. He told himself repeatedly that his preoccupation with Eleanor Whitmore's circumstances stemmed purely from a desire to right a wrong, to restore his own sense of honor after behaving so poorly in his own home. But late at night, when sleep would not come, he found himself remembering not the humiliation he had caused her, but the unbroken steadiness with which she had endured it, the quiet dignity that had refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. It was, he admitted to himself finally, an uncomfortable kind of admiration, tangled inextricably with guilt he did not know how to unravel. News of a different kind reached Ashford Estate near the end of that month, delivered by a courier who had traveled from London with unusual urgency. It was an invitation, addressed to Edmund directly, to a gathering hosted by Lord Pembroke, a man of considerable influence whose approval mattered greatly to families across the capital. The invitation mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Miss Eleanor Whitmore of the Fairweather line would be attending as a guest of honor, recently welcomed back into society following the confirmation of her family's restored standing. Edmund read the invitation twice, his pulse quickening in a way that surprised him. He understood immediately what it meant. Eleanor was not simply reclaiming her place in society. She was doing so publicly, deliberately, in circles that overlapped directly with his own. At a gathering he could not decline without drawing exactly the kind of attention he least wanted. "You will attend, of course," Charlotte said, watching his expression as he read the letter a third time. "I do not see that I have a choice." "You have always had a choice, Edmund. You simply have not always chosen well." Charlotte's tone softened slightly. "This may be your opportunity to choose differently." Edmund spent the following days in a state of unfamiliar uncertainty, drafting and discarding apologies he knew would ring hollow if delivered without genuine understanding behind them. He asked Margaret during a brief visit to Ashford exactly what had happened to Eleanor after that night, and Margaret, though still carrying some resentment toward him, relented enough to share what little she knew of Eleanor's journey to London, of the claim she had pursued, of the quiet strength she had shown in rebuilding everything he had so carelessly dismissed. "She did not do this for you, Edmund," Margaret said pointedly. "She did not vanish that night and rebuild her life so that you might feel better about your own behavior. Whatever ground she has reclaimed, she reclaimed it for herself." "I understand that," Edmund said quietly. "Do you? Because if you attend Lord Pembroke's gathering expecting gratitude, or expecting her to accept a simple apology as though it erases what happened, you will find yourself disappointed. Eleanor Whitmore does not need your approval anymore, Edmund. That is precisely what makes this moment so difficult for you." Edmund absorbed this in silence, recognizing the truth of it even as some old, stubborn part of him resisted the discomfort it caused. He had spent his entire life in a position where his approval mattered, where his judgment shaped the fortunes and reputations of those around him without consequence. The prospect of facing a woman who no longer required anything from him, who had rebuilt herself entirely outside the reach of his influence, unsettled him in ways he had not anticipated. On the morning of the gathering, he stood before his mirror longer than usual, adjusting his coat with unusual care, aware of a nervousness he had rarely experienced in his adult life. He thought of the note still resting in his desk drawer. "You will not see me until you understand what you have done." He was not certain, even now, that he fully understood it, but he intended, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, to try. The carriage ride to London felt longer than any journey he could remember, each mile carrying him closer to a reckoning he had spent weeks both dreading and, in some quiet, unacknowledged corner of himself, anticipating. Along the way, his coachman was forced to slow near a crowded crossing, and Edmund found himself watching the ordinary bustle of the city outside his window, clerks hurrying between offices, flower sellers calling out their wares, children weaving between carriages with the fearless energy of youth. It struck him, watching this unfamiliar scene with unfamiliar attention, how little he actually knew of the world beyond his own estate, how narrow his understanding had been of who deserved a seat at his table and who did not. He had spent his life believing that birth and fortune were the only true measures of a person's worth, and in a single careless evening, he had been forced to confront how badly that belief had failed him. He thought again of his mother's words. "You have made an enemy tonight, and you do not even know her name beyond the one that displeases you." At the time, he had dismissed the warning as maternal exaggeration. Now, weeks later, watching London pass by his window on his way to face the consequences of that single evening, he understood exactly how right she had been. Somewhere in that city, Eleanor Whitmore was preparing for the same evening, standing before her own mirror with considerably more confidence than the last time their paths had crossed. She had chosen her gown carefully, a deep green that suited her far better than the borrowed blue she had worn to Ashford Estate, and as she fastened a simple silver pendant, the last piece of jewelry that had belonged to her mother, she studied her own reflection with a steadiness that would have surprised the woman who had walked so quietly toward a servant's table months before. She was not attending Lord Pembroke's gathering to seek revenge, though she would not deny that the thought of Edmund Ashford's discomfort held a certain grim satisfaction. She was attending because she had earned her place there, because every document signed and every hearing endured had led to this evening, and because she intended to walk into that room exactly as she had walked out of Ashford Estate months before, with her spine straight, her composure unbroken, and no need whatsoever for anyone else's approval. Nathaniel Fairweather arrived to escort her personally, offering his arm with evident pride as they descended toward the waiting carriage. "You look every inch of Fairweather tonight," he told her. "Tonight," Eleanor replied quietly. I intend to look every inch myself." The journey to Lord Pembroke's estate passed in comfortable silence, Eleanor watching the same city lights that Edmund had watched only hours before, both of them moving steadily toward a meeting neither could fully predict, ready to meet the Duke of Ashford not as a woman cast aside, but as one who had built, with her own hands and her own unbroken will, every inch of ground she now stood upon. The ballroom at Lord Pembroke's estate glittered with 1,000 candles, and the moment Eleanor stepped through the doors, conversation seemed to pause around her in a way that felt entirely different from the silence that had greeted her at Ashford Estate months before. This silence carried curiosity, not judgment. Whispers followed her, but they were whispers of interest, of admiration for the woman who had reclaimed her family's standing through nothing but her own determination. Edmund saw her before she saw him. He stood near the far end of the ballroom, glass in hand, and felt every rehearsed word he had prepared during the carriage ride dissolve the instant she entered the room. She wore deep green, her dark hair arranged simply but elegantly, and she moved through the crowd with an ease that suggested she had never once doubted her right to be there. She was, he realized with a discomfort he had not anticipated, more striking than he remembered, though he understood immediately that her transformation was not one of appearance but of bearing. The woman who had walked silently toward a servant's table now moved as though she owned the very air around her. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, neither moved. Then Eleanor inclined her head, the same small, precise gesture she had offered him the night he humiliated her, and turned to greet Lord Pembroke's wife with warm, easy conversation, leaving Edmund standing exactly where he was, uncertain whether he had just been acknowledged or dismissed. It took him nearly an hour to gather the courage to approach her, an unfamiliar sensation for a man accustomed to commanding rooms rather than hesitating at their edges. When he finally did, Eleanor was standing near a tall window, speaking with Oliver Bellamy, who had apparently traveled to London specifically to attend Lord Pembroke's gathering and offer his support. "Your Grace," Eleanor's voice was polite, measured, betraying nothing of the emotion Edmund half hoped and half feared to find there. "Miss Whitmore." He hesitated, aware of Oliver's watchful presence beside her. "Might I have a moment of your time?" Oliver's expression tightened slightly, but Eleanor placed a light hand on his arm. "Excuse me a moment, Oliver." She stepped aside with Edmund, near a quiet alcove away from the densest part of the crowd, and folded her hands in front of her, waiting with the patient, unreadable calm of a woman who had learned to give nothing away until she chose to. "I owe you an apology," Edmund began, the words feeling clumsy and insufficient the moment they left him. "What I did that night was inexcusable. I judged you on a name and a rumor, and I humiliated you in front of my entire household without a single thought for what it might cost you." "It cost me a great deal," Eleanor said simply, "though perhaps not in the way you intended. I have thought of little else since that evening." "Have you?" Eleanor's tone remained even, though something flickered briefly in her eyes. "And what conclusion have you reached, after so much thought?" Edmund hesitated, searching for words that would not sound like the empty apologies of a man merely seeking to ease his own conscience. "That I judged you unfairly. That your family's misfortune said nothing about your character, and everything about the cruelty of a system that punishes honest men for the deceptions of others. That I have rarely, if ever, met someone who endured public humiliation with the composure you showed that night, and that composure has stayed with me every day since." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and Edmund found himself unable to read anything in her expression, a skill he suspected she had cultivated deliberately over the past 3 years, perfected through countless rooms far less forgiving than this one. "You are not wrong in any of that," she said finally. "But an apology delivered months later, after learning that I have reclaimed a fortune and connections you now find useful, is difficult to separate from convenience, Your Grace. Had I remained the ruined daughter of a disgraced magistrate, would you have sought me out to deliver this same apology?" The question struck him with unexpected force, precisely because he did not have a confident answer to it. "I would like to believe I would have. But you do not know," Eleanor said quietly, "and neither, truthfully, do I." They stood in silence for a moment, the distant sound of music and conversation filling the space between them. Edmund felt, more acutely than he had in years, the weight of his own failure, not simply the cruelty of that single evening, but the deeper failure of a lifetime spent assuming his judgment required no scrutiny. "I do not ask you to forgive me tonight," he said finally. "I understand that may take considerably longer than a single conversation, if it happens at all. I ask only that you allow me the chance to prove, over time, that my regret is genuine, and not merely a reaction to your changed circumstances." Eleanor considered this for a long moment, her gaze steady on his. I will allow you the chance to try, Your Grace. I will not promise you the outcome you hope for. It was, Edmund understood, far more than he had any right to expect, and he found himself grateful for it in a way that surprised him with its intensity. Before their conversation could continue further, Margaret Ellison found them, having crossed the ballroom the moment she noticed the two speaking privately. Her expression carried a mixture of caution and hope as she looked between them. Eleanor, she said gently, I owe you an apology of my own. I promised you a quiet evening and instead delivered you into the very humiliation I meant to spare you from. I have carried that guilt for months. Eleanor's expression softened noticeably for Margaret in a way it had not for Edmund. You did nothing wrong, Margaret. You could not have known how the evening would unfold. I could have argued harder against it happening, Margaret said. I should have. You did argue, Eleanor reminded her. I remember it clearly. There is no fault in losing an argument to a duke in his own home. Margaret glanced briefly at Edmund, a flicker of something between amusement and reproach crossing her face. No, I suppose there is not. She turned back to Eleanor with genuine warmth. I am simply glad to see you well, and more than well. You look every inch the woman your mother always said you would become. Thank you, Margaret, truly. The two women embraced briefly, and Edmund found himself observing the exchange with a strange, unfamiliar feeling, something like envy, for the easy warmth Eleanor extended so readily to Margaret, a warmth she had measured out to him only in the smallest, most careful increments. Margaret excused herself a moment later to greet other guests, leaving Edmund and Eleanor alone once more, though the interruption had shifted something in the conversation's tone, softened its edges slightly. You are fortunate to have her regard, Edmund observed. She has spoken of you often these past months. Her guilt over that evening has weighed on her considerably. She has nothing to feel guilty for, Eleanor said firmly. The fault was never hers. No, Edmund agreed quietly. It was entirely mine. Eleanor studied him for a moment, as though weighing whether to say more, before allowing herself a small measure of candor. For what it is worth, Your Grace, I do not hold Margaret responsible in any way, and I have never doubted her friendship. Whether I can say the same of your intentions remains, as I said, a matter of time and conduct rather than words spoken in a single evening. That seems a fair measure, Edmund said. I do not ask for more than the chance to meet it. Their conversation was interrupted by Lord Pembroke himself, a stout, cheerful man who swept Eleanor away to introduce her to a circle of guests eager to make her acquaintance, leaving Edmund standing alone near the window, watching her move through the room with the same effortless grace she had shown all evening. Oliver Bellamy appeared at his side a moment later, his expression carefully neutral, though Edmund sensed an undercurrent of tension beneath it. You spoke with her. I did. She deserves better than a single apology offered after society decided her worth had changed, Oliver said, his voice low but firm. I have known Eleanor since we were children. I watched what that evening cost her, even if she would never admit it aloud. If you intend to pursue her regard, Your Grace, I would advise you to understand that it will not be won easily, nor should it be. Edmund studied the younger man for a moment, recognizing in his tone something beyond simple loyalty to a childhood friend. You care for her. Oliver did not deny it. I have cared for her for a long time. I did not press the matter while her family struggled, because I would not have her believe my regard was tied to convenience, any more than yours currently appears to be, but I do not intend to remain silent forever. The two men regarded each other with a wary, unspoken understanding, and Edmund felt, for the first time, the sharp edge of jealousy accompanying his guilt, a complication he had not anticipated when he set out that evening merely hoping to offer an overdue apology. The remainder of the evening passed with Eleanor moving easily among the gathered guests, her reputation clearly restored beyond question, while Edmund watched from a careful distance, aware that Oliver's warning had not been idle, and aware, too, that his own feelings toward Eleanor Whitmore had become considerably more complicated than simple guilt over a single evening's cruelty. As the gathering began to wind down and guests started calling for their carriages, Edmund found one final opportunity to speak with Eleanor near the entrance hall, where she stood waiting for her uncle to bring the carriage around. I hope to see you again, he said quietly. London society is not so large that our paths are unlikely to cross, Eleanor replied, her tone carefully neutral. Whether those crossings amount to anything more than polite acquaintance remains, I think, entirely up to how you conduct yourself going forward. Then I intend to conduct myself carefully. A faint, almost imperceptible softness touched the corner of her mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. We shall see, Your Grace. She stepped into her carriage without another word, leaving Edmund standing in the cold night air outside Lord Pembroke's estate, watching the carriage disappear down the long drive, aware that whatever ground he hoped to reclaim with Eleanor Whitmore would need to be earned slowly, carefully, and without any guarantee of success, a realization that unsettled him considerably less than he expected, replaced instead by a quiet, stubborn determination to try regardless. Behind him, Charlotte approached, having watched the exchange from a discreet distance. "Well," she said, studying her son's expression with evident interest, "that is not the face of a man merely settling a debt of conscience." Edmund did not answer, because he was no longer entirely certain the distinction mattered as much as he had once believed it did. The carriage ride home passed in near total silence, Charlotte watching her son with quiet curiosity as he stared out at the passing darkness, his thoughts clearly far from the comfortable rhythm of the road. She had known Edmund his entire life, had watched him grow from a careful, dutiful boy into a man who mistook rigid certainty for strength, and she recognized in his current silence something she had rarely seen in him before: genuine uncertainty about a matter he could not simply command his way through. "You are troubled," she said finally, breaking the quiet. "I am reconsidering a great many things," Edmund admitted. "Good," Charlotte said simply. "You are in sore need of reconsidering a great many things, Edmund. I have watched you conduct yourself as though the world owed you certainty on every matter, when in truth, certainty is often nothing more than a failure to look closely enough at what stands before you." Edmund turned to look at his mother, surprised by the bluntness of her words. "You never spoke so plainly of it before." "Before, you would not have listened. Tonight, I suspect you might." Charlotte's expression softened. "Eleanor Whitmore is not a woman who will be won through titles or apologies alone, Edmund. She has rebuilt her life through her own strength, without waiting for anyone's permission to do so. If you hope to earn her regard, you will need to become a man worthy of standing beside that strength, not above it." Edmund considered his mother's words carefully as the carriage rolled on through the dark countryside toward Ashford Estate. He thought of Oliver Bellamy's quiet warning, of Eleanor's measured caution, of the long road that clearly lay ahead of him if he hoped to earn something more than polite acquaintance from a woman he had once dismissed without a second thought. It would not be easy. He understood that now with a clarity he had lacked even hours before, walking into Lord Pembroke's ballroom with nothing but a rehearsed apology, and an assumption that regret alone would be sufficient. Eleanor had built an entirely new life from the wreckage he had contributed to, and she owed him nothing, not forgiveness, not patience, not even the smallest measure of her time. And yet she had granted him a chance, however narrow, however carefully guarded. That, Edmund decided as Ashford Estate's familiar gates came into view, was more than he had any right to expect, and he intended to spend every day that followed proving himself worthy of it, regardless of how long the effort required, or how uncertain its outcome remained. The invitation arrived at Ashford Estate exactly 2 months after Lord Pembroke's gathering, and Edmund recognized the handwriting on the envelope before he had even broken the seal. Margaret Ellison was hosting a second dinner, the very same room, the very same long table, and this time, she had written plainly that Eleanor Whitmore would be seated at its head as guest of honor. Edmund read the invitation 3 times, understanding immediately what Margaret intended. This was not simply a dinner. It was a deliberate correction, staged in the very hall where the original humiliation had occurred, in front of many of the same guests who had witnessed it. Whether Margaret meant it as an opportunity for Edmund's redemption, or as a pointed reminder of his failure, he could not entirely tell, though he suspected it was, in some measure, both. In the weeks between the 2 gatherings, Edmund had made good on his word as carefully as circumstances allowed. He wrote to Eleanor regularly, brief letters at first, careful not to presume too much familiarity, gradually growing longer and more genuine as she began, cautiously, to respond. He learned of her progress restoring the Belmont land, of the small tenant farm she was rebuilding with the returned trust funds, of her plans to establish the estate not as a grand seat of fashion but as a working, self-sufficient property that would never again be vulnerable to a single failed investment. He offered assistance where he could, connections to reliable tenant managers, introductions to fair-minded merchants, all offered without expectation and, more importantly, without any suggestion that his help came with conditions attached. Slowly, carefully, something between them had begun to shift, though Eleanor remained guarded in ways that told him her trust, once broken, would not be easily or fully restored. The evening of the second dinner arrived cold and clear, and Edmund found himself standing once more in the great hall of Ashford Estate, though this time the room felt different entirely, charged with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the food or wine being served. Eleanor arrived precisely on time. dressed in deep burgundy that suited the formality of the occasion, and when Nathaniel the butler announced her name, the room fell silent, in a way that echoed, deliberately, the silence of that first terrible evening. But this silence carried none of the earlier cruelty. Every eye in the room understood exactly what this moment represented. Margaret rose to greet her personally, embracing her warmly before leading her, with visible ceremony, to the seat at the head of the table, the very position of honor Edmund himself had once occupied, while Eleanor sat among the servants. Edmund watched this unfold from his own seat, now positioned along the table's length rather than at its head, a small but deliberate rearrangement Margaret had insisted upon without explanation, though its meaning was unmistakable to everyone present. "Miss Whitmore," Margaret announced to the assembled guests, "has honored us tonight, not merely as a guest, but as a woman who has reclaimed, through her own strength and determination, everything that was once wrongly taken from her family's name. I could think of no more fitting place for her than the head of this table." A murmur of approval moved through the room, and Edmund felt the weight of every eye that had once witnessed Eleanor's humiliation now turning, in some measure toward him, waiting to see how he would respond to a moment so carefully and pointedly arranged. He rose from his seat. The room quieted further, and Eleanor's gaze met his across the length of the table, steady and unreadable, giving him nothing to work from, no signal of what she hoped or expected him to say. "Some months ago," Edmund began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "I stood in this very room and made a decision I have regretted every day since. I judged Miss Whitmore by rumor rather than character, and in doing so, I revealed far more about my own failings than I ever did about hers. I will not pretend that words alone can undo what was done that evening, but I would like this room, and Miss Whitmore herself, to understand clearly that I was wrong, entirely and without excuse, and that whatever measure of respect this house owes her, it owes doubly for the manner in which it was first withheld." He paused, aware that every word carried weight far beyond the room itself, that guests present tonight would carry this account into drawing rooms across London by morning, but he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not care about the gossip it might generate. He cared only about the steady, careful expression on Eleanor's face, searching for some sign of whether his words had reached her. Eleanor rose slowly from her seat, and the room held its breath collectively, uncertain what she intended. "I accept the acknowledgement, Your Grace," she said, her voice calm and clear. "Though I would ask this room to remember something else as well. My family's misfortune, and the misfortune of any family that loses its standing through no true fault of its own, does not diminish the worth of the person who endures it. I did not require this table's approval to know my own value that evening, and I do not require it now. I accept your acknowledgement because I believe it to be sincere, not because I needed it to confirm what I have always known to be true of myself." A ripple of quiet admiration moved through the gathered guests, and even Charlotte, watching from her own seat with careful attention, allowed herself a small, approving smile. It was in the midst of this fragile, carefully rebuilt atmosphere that the evening took an unexpected turn. A guest near the far end of the table, a minor lord named Frederick Ashcombe, who had long harbored quiet resentment toward Edmund over an old dispute involving shared boundary lands, rose with a glass of wine in hand and a deliberately provocative smile. "While we are all engaged in confessions this evening," Ashcombe said, his voice carrying a false lightness that immediately put Edmund on guard, "perhaps the Duke would care to share with Miss Whitmore exactly how secure his own family's fortune currently stands. I understand there have been rather significant losses in recent investments, losses that some might argue leave Ashford's finances in considerably less certain condition than this grand hall would suggest." The room went utterly still. Edmund felt the color drain briefly from his face before he mastered his expression, aware that every eye had turned toward him with fresh, hungry curiosity. It was true, though he had told almost no one outside his own solicitor and his mother. A series of poor investments made by his late father years before had left certain estate holdings encumbered by debt far more precarious than Ashford's outward grandeur suggested. Edmund had spent the past 2 years quietly working to correct the situation, but the matter remained far from resolved, and the public exposure of it, delivered so deliberately in front of London's gathered society, threatened consequences he had not prepared himself to face. "That is a private matter," Edmund said carefully, "and not one for discussion at Lady Ellison's table." "Perhaps not," Ashcombe replied, clearly enjoying the discomfort he had caused, "but it seems only fair, given the evening's theme of honest reckoning, that Miss Whitmore should understand exactly what circumstances she is considering aligning herself with, should the Duke's evident interest in her continue as it appears to be doing." Eleanor's expression remained carefully composed, though Edmund caught the smallest flicker of surprise cross her features before she mastered it entirely. She said nothing immediately, allowing the silence to stretch long enough that Ashcombe's satisfied smile began to falter slightly under its weight. "Lord Ashcombe," she said finally, her voice cool and precise, "I have spent the past several months rebuilding my own family's fortune from far worse circumstances than mismanaged investments. I understand, better than most in this room, that financial difficulty says nothing about a person's character, only about the misfortune or misjudgment that produced it. If you intended this revelation to diminish the Duke in my estimation, I am afraid you have badly misjudged both of us." A soft ripple of surprised approval moved through the room, and Ashcombe's expression soured considerably as he realized his provocation had failed to land as intended. He sat back down without further comment, and conversation slowly resumed around the table, though the tension of the moment lingered in the air long after his voice had fallen silent. Later that evening, once the meal had concluded and guests had begun retiring to the drawing room for cards and conversation, Edmund found a moment to speak with Eleanor privately, near the same hearth where Charlotte had once questioned his judgment months before. "I owe you an explanation," he said quietly. "You owe me nothing. You are not ready to give freely," Eleanor replied, "though I confess I am curious how serious the difficulty truly is." Edmund hesitated only briefly before answering honestly, a decision that surprised him even as he made it. "Serious enough that I have spent 2 years working quietly to correct it, without success significant enough to consider the matter resolved. My father made poor decisions before his passing, decisions I inherited without warning or preparation, much as your own father's misfortune found you." Eleanor studied him carefully, something shifting behind her eyes. "You might have told me this weeks ago, rather than allowing Lord Ashcombe the satisfaction of revealing it publicly." "I was ashamed," Edmund admitted. It seemed a poor foundation to build any regard upon, admitting weakness so soon after asking for your trust. "Weakness," Eleanor repeated, something almost gentle entering her tone. "Your Grace, I spent 3 years learning that acknowledging weakness honestly is a far greater strength than pretending it does not exist. Had you told me plainly from the beginning, I would have respected you considerably more for it than I do discovering it through Lord Ashcombe's petty mischief." Edmund absorbed this with a mixture of relief and renewed determination. "Then let me be plain now. Ashford's finances require careful management for several years yet before the estate stands as secure as it should. I do not know what that means for any future between us, but I would rather you know the full truth of my circumstances than continue believing me more secure than I currently am." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression he could not fully read. "Thank you for telling me honestly, even belatedly. That honesty matters more to me than any fortune, secure or otherwise." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Oliver Bellamy, who had traveled from London specifically for the occasion, and now approached with an expression that suggested he had witnessed at least part of their exchange from across the room. "Eleanor," he said, his tone carefully polite, though an undercurrent of tension ran beneath it, "your uncle asked me to remind you that the hour grows late, and the roads back to your lodgings are poorly lit past midnight." "Thank you, Oliver. I will join him shortly." Eleanor's tone remained warm, though Edmund noticed she did not extend the conversation, a small courtesy that Oliver seemed to notice as well, his jaw tightening slightly. "Might I have a private word, Your Grace?" Oliver asked, turning to Edmund with a directness that left little room for refusal. Eleanor excused herself to find her uncle, leaving the two men alone near the hearth, and Oliver wasted no time once she was out of earshot. "I saw the exchange at dinner," he said. "Ashcombe's revelation, and your conversation with Eleanor afterward. I will not pretend I am pleased to see you continuing to pursue her regard, particularly now that it seems your circumstances are considerably less secure than this house suggests." "My circumstances are my own concern," Edmund replied evenly, "and Eleanor's regard, if I am fortunate enough to earn it, is hers to give as she chooses, not yours to guard on her behalf." "She is my oldest friend," Oliver said, his voice sharpening. "I have watched her endure more hardship than any person should be asked to bear, and I will not stand quietly by while a man who once humiliated her publicly now courts her out of guilt, convenience, or worse, a need to shore up his own failing fortune with a wife of restored means." The accusation struck harder than Edmund expected, precisely because it contained a grain of a fear he had not fully examined in himself. He had told himself repeatedly that his pursuit of Eleanor's regard came from genuine remorse and growing admiration, nothing more calculated than that. But Oliver's words forced him to consider, uncomfortably, whether some smaller, less honorable part of him recognized the practical benefit of an alliance with a woman whose restored fortune might ease his own estate's difficulties. "I will not insult either of us by claiming the thought never crossed my mind," Edmund said finally, choosing honesty over easy denial. "But I can tell you plainly that it is not what drives me. If it were merely fortune I sought, there are wealthier families in London, considerably more eager to align themselves with a duke than Eleanor has shown herself to be. I pursue her regard because I have not been able to stop thinking of her composure that first terrible evening, because every letter she has sent me these past weeks has revealed a mind and character I find myself admiring more with each exchange, and because I would rather earn a lifetime of her honest disapproval than a single day of convenient affection built on anything less than truth." Oliver studied him for a long moment, some of the hostility in his expression softening, though not entirely fading. "Fine words, Your Grace. I hope, for Eleanor's sake, that they prove true over time, rather than simply in the moment they were spoken." "That is a fair measure to hold me to," Edmund said. "I do not ask you to trust my words tonight. I ask only that you allow time to prove or disprove them, rather than deciding the matter on my behalf before I have had the chance to show my conduct honestly." Oliver did not answer immediately, and for a moment the two men stood in a silence weighted with unspoken rivalry, each recognizing in the other a genuine regard for the same woman, neither willing to concede ground easily. Finally, Oliver gave a short, reluctant nod. "Time, then," he said. "But know that I will be watching closely, Your Grace, and I will not hesitate to speak plainly to Eleanor if I believe your conduct falls short of your words." "I would expect nothing less from a true friend," Edmund replied, and meant it, recognizing in Oliver's fierce protectiveness exactly the kind of loyalty Eleanor deserved, whether it came from him or from another. Oliver departed to find Eleanor and her uncle, leaving Edmund alone once more by the hearth, turning over the weight of everything the evening had revealed, not only about his fortunes and his failures, but about the genuine competition he now faced for a regard he was no longer entirely certain he could win through apology and honesty alone. She did not offer further reassurance beyond that, and Edmund understood he had not yet fully earned the trust he hoped to rebuild. But something had shifted between them that evening nonetheless, a foundation laid not on apology alone, but on honesty offered freely, however imperfectly timed, and as the evening drew to its close, Edmund found himself walking away from Ashford's second dinner with considerably more hope than he had carried into it, alongside a clearer understanding of exactly how much further he still had to go before that hope might be fully realized. Snow had begun to fall over Belmont by the time Edmund's carriage arrived, the fields around Eleanor's newly restored estate stretching white and quiet beneath a pale winter sky. He had written ahead to request a visit, though he had given no specific reason beyond a wish to see how her tenant restoration efforts were progressing, a careful excuse that both of them understood carried far more weight beneath its surface. Eleanor met him in the estate's modest but well-kept entrance hall, dressed simply for the working visit she assumed he had come for, her manner warmer than it had been even at Margaret's second dinner, though still carrying the measured caution he had come to expect and, in some strange way, to respect. "You did not need to travel so far in this weather," she said, though her tone held genuine welcome rather than reproach. "I wanted to see it," Edmund replied. "Everything you have built here, and I wanted to speak with you somewhere away from London's watchful eyes and Lord Ashcombe's petty mischief." She led him through the estate herself, showing him the tenant cottages she had rebuilt with careful attention to both function and dignity, the small mill she had restored to working order, providing steady income for families who had struggled for years under the estate's previous neglect. Edmund listened as she spoke, genuine admiration growing with each detail she described, recognizing in her methodical, thoughtful approach to rebuilding Belmont a wisdom and capability that far exceeded his own management of Ashford's considerably grander holdings. "You have done in months what many landowners fail to accomplish in years," he said as they walked together along a snow-dusted path between the cottages. "I had considerable motivation," Eleanor replied. "I know intimately what happens to families when an estate is mismanaged. I was determined that no family under my care would suffer as mine did." "You have succeeded admirably." Eleanor glanced at him sideways, a faint smile touching her lips. "You did not travel through a snowstorm merely to praise my tenant cottages, Your Grace." Edmund stopped walking, and Eleanor stopped beside him, waiting with an expression that suggested she already suspected what he intended to say, though she gave him no easy path toward saying it. "I have spent these past months trying to prove, through action rather than words, that my regard for you is genuine," he said, choosing his words with more care than he had ever applied to any address, any negotiation, any decision of his life. I have shared with you the full truth of my circumstances, uncertain fortune and all, because I would rather you know exactly what you would be considering than allow you to discover it, as Ashcombe so nearly forced upon us both, at a moment I could not control. You have been honest, Eleanor acknowledged quietly. I have noticed and valued it more than you perhaps realize. I do not ask you to forget how we began, Edmund continued. I do not believe such a thing is possible, nor do I believe it should be. What happened that first evening was a genuine failure of character on my part, and I will carry the memory of it, and the lesson it taught me, for the rest of my life. But I have come to believe, over these past months, that the man I am now, the man your composure and your strength have shaped me into becoming, might be worthy of standing beside you, not above you, not commanding your regard through title or fortune, but earning it honestly, day by day, for as long as you would allow me the chance to keep trying. Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, snow settling softly on her dark hair, her expression carrying an emotion Edmund could not fully name, something caught between caution and a hope she seemed almost afraid to allow herself. Oliver warned me you might come here with exactly this intention, she said finally. And what did you tell him? I told him that I intended to make my own judgment of your character, based on your conduct, and not on his fears or my own old wounds. She paused, studying him carefully. You have conducted yourself these past months with more honesty and humility than I believed you capable of that first terrible evening. I will not pretend the memory of that night no longer troubles me. It does, and likely always will. But I have also come to believe that a person's worst moment need not define the whole of who they are, provided they show, through sustained and genuine effort, that they have truly learned from it. Then what would you have me do? Edmund asked quietly, to prove that sustained effort continues, beyond a single visit in the snow. Eleanor considered this seriously, as she considered everything, before answering. I would have you understand that I will not be a solution to your estate's difficulties, nor a fortune to be quietly relied upon to ease your family's financial troubles. Whatever future we might build together, I intend to build it as an equal partner, managing my own lands, my own tenants, my own fortune, exactly as I have managed them since reclaiming them. If you seek a wife who will simply merge her resources into yours and disappear into the role of Duchess, you have come to the wrong door. I seek no such wife, Edmund said firmly. I have watched you rebuild Belmont with a skill I openly admit exceeds my own management of Ashford. If you would have me, I would welcome your guidance in restoring my own estate's fortunes, not as a silent benefactor, but as a partner whose judgment I have come to trust and respect above nearly anyone else I know. A genuine smile broke across Eleanor's face then, the first he had seen directed fully at him since that terrible first evening, and something in his chest loosened at the sight of it, a tension he had carried, he realized, for months without fully acknowledging its weight. Then perhaps, she said, we might discuss this further, somewhere warmer than a snow-covered path. They returned to the estate's modest drawing room, where a fire burned steadily against the winter cold, and spent the remainder of the afternoon in conversation that ranged far beyond estate management, touching on childhood memories, on their fathers' respective legacies, on hopes neither had allowed themselves to voice aloud in longer than either cared to admit. Edmund found himself laughing more freely than he had in years, and Eleanor, watching him across the small table between them, felt something in her own carefully guarded heart begin, cautiously, to open. Before Edmund departed Belmont that first snow-covered afternoon, Eleanor walked him to his waiting carriage, both of them lingering longer at the door than either quite admitted was necessary. I have one more condition, she said, before I allow myself to hope for anything further between us. Name it. Beatrice, the cook who showed me the only true kindness that evening at Ashford, deserves recognition for it. If our futures are to be joined in any way, I would have her position at your household secured and honored, not as a small gesture, but as a genuine acknowledgement of what her simple decency meant to me that night. Edmund did not hesitate. It will be done before the week is out. I should have recognized her kindness myself, rather than requiring you to ask for it on her behalf. Eleanor studied him a moment longer, something warm settling behind her careful composure. That answer alone tells me more about your genuine change than any words spoken in Margaret's hall ever could. The following weeks brought a steady correspondence between Ashford and Belmont, letters growing warmer with each exchange, punctuated by careful visits that Edmund made a point of announcing well in advance, never presuming upon Eleanor's time or hospitality. He brought with him, on one such visit, his mother Charlotte, who had insisted upon meeting the woman who had so thoroughly reshaped her son's character. Charlotte and Eleanor spent an entire afternoon walking Belmont's grounds together. Deep in conversation, Edmund was not invited to join, and when he finally saw his mother that evening, her expression carried an approval he had rarely witnessed her extend to anyone. "She is remarkable," Charlotte told him simply. "Far more remarkable than you deserve, though I suspect you already know that." "I know it entirely," Edmund admitted. "Good. See that you never forget it, particularly once the difficulty of courtship gives way to the far greater difficulty of an actual marriage. Admiration is easy to offer at a distance, Edmund. It is considerably harder to sustain across the ordinary friction of daily life. I trust you understand the difference." "I intend to spend the rest of my life learning it properly," Edmund said, and Charlotte, satisfied by the sincerity in his voice, said nothing further on the matter, though her approval remained evident in every interaction that followed. Eleanor's uncle, Nathaniel Fairweather, proved a harder audience to win over entirely, watching Edmund's continued visits with the careful scrutiny of a man who remembered clearly the humiliation his niece had endured. But even he, over the following months, began to soften, as he witnessed the genuine partnership growing between them, Edmund consulting Eleanor on estate matters with real deference to her judgment, Eleanor extending trust in careful, measured increments that grew steadily less guarded with each passing month. Oliver Bellamy remained more difficult still, his own feelings for Eleanor unresolved even as he watched her regard for Edmund deepen into something he could no longer credibly dismiss as convenience or guilt. It was Eleanor herself who finally addressed the matter directly, seeking him out during a visit to London in early spring. "You have been my dearest friend since childhood," she told him plainly, "and I will not lose that friendship over a matter of the heart you and I never truly shared beyond the comfortable ease of old acquaintance. I care for you deeply, Oliver, but not in the way you have perhaps hoped, and I think, if you are honest with yourself, you have known that for some time." Oliver absorbed this with visible difficulty, though something like relief eventually crossed his expression, the relief of finally hearing plainly what he had long suspected but never allowed himself to fully accept. "I suppose I have known it," he admitted. "I simply did not wish to." "You deserve someone who returns your regard as fully as you offer it," Eleanor said gently. "I hope you will allow yourself to find her, rather than continuing to measure every woman against a friendship that was never meant to become anything more." Oliver managed a rueful smile. "You have grown considerably wiser than the girl I remember climbing trees at Belmont as a child." "I have had considerable cause to grow wiser," Eleanor replied, and the two embraced as the old, easy friends they had always been, the tension between them finally, genuinely resolved. Word of Edmund's visit to Belmont spread through London society within days, carried by servants and tenant families who had witnessed the Duke's carriage arriving and departing with unusual frequency over the following weeks. Speculation grew rapidly, and by the time spring arrived, thawing the last of winter's snow from Belmont's fields, few in London society doubted that an announcement of some significance was forthcoming. It came at a small gathering hosted by Margaret Ellison, fittingly, in the same great hall where the entire story had begun. This time, the table was arranged not with a single guest of honor, but with two seats positioned side by side at its head, and when Edmund rose during the evening's final course, the room fell into an expectant silence that carried none of the dread of that first terrible night, only warm anticipation. "Nearly a year ago," Edmund began, "I stood in this hall and made the worst decision of my life, seating a woman of extraordinary character among the servants of my own household, because I judged her unworthy, based on nothing more than rumor and misplaced pride. I have spent every day since attempting to prove myself worthy of the forgiveness I did not deserve, and tonight, I am profoundly grateful to say that Eleanor Whitmore has agreed to become my wife, not out of convenience, not out of pity, but because she has chosen, after careful and considered judgment of my character, to build a future alongside me as an equal partner in every sense." He turned to Eleanor, who rose to stand beside him, her expression carrying the same unshaken composure she had shown that first terrible evening, though now warmed by genuine happiness rather than defiant endurance. "I do not enter this marriage as the woman who was once humiliated at this table," Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady. "I enter it as a woman who rebuilt her family's fortune through her own strength, who chose this partnership freely and on her own terms, and who intends to stand beside Edmund Ashford as his equal, not beneath him, not above him, but exactly beside him, for as long as we both continue to earn each other's respect." The room erupted into warm applause, and even Lord Ashcombe, present despite the awkwardness of his earlier mischief, offered a reluctant nod of acknowledgement from his seat further down the table. Later that evening, as guests mingled and the celebration continued around them, Edmund found a quiet moment alone with Eleanor, near the same hearth where their reconciliation had first begun to take shape months before. "Do you remember the note you left me?" he asked. "You will not see me until you understand what you have done." "I remember every word of it," Eleanor said. "I meant it entirely, in that moment." "And now?" She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, with a warmth that would have seemed impossible to imagine on that cold, humiliating night, nearly a year before. "Now I believe you understand, not because you have told me so, but because you have shown me so, in every honest letter, every genuine effort, every moment you chose truth over convenience. That understanding, Edmund, is worth considerably more to me than any apology could ever be." Outside, the same great hall glowed with candlelight it had carried on that first terrible evening. But the room within it had changed entirely. Its walls now witnessed not to careless cruelty, but to a hard-won reconciliation built patiently, honestly, and entirely on its own merit. The wedding took place at Belmont in early summer, Eleanor's choice rather than Ashford, a quiet but deliberate statement that this union would begin on ground she had rebuilt with her own hands, rather than beneath the shadow of the hall where her humiliation had first occurred. The tenant families she had restored to prosperity lined the path to the small stone chapel, many of them weeping openly at the sight of the woman who had given them back their livelihoods now beginning a new chapter of her own. Beatrice traveled from Ashford to attend, given a place of honor near the front of the small gathering, and when Eleanor passed her on the way toward the altar, she paused just long enough to press the old cook's hand warmly between her own, a silent acknowledgement of the kindness that had sustained her through the darkest hour of that first terrible evening. Margaret wept through the entire ceremony, seated beside a considerably more composed but equally moved Charlotte, while Nathaniel Fairweather walked Eleanor down the short aisle, with the fierce, quiet pride of a man finally able to honor the niece he had failed to support soon enough. Oliver stood among the guests as well, having arrived with a young woman he had recently begun courting, his own happiness, genuine and unclouded by old regret. When Edmund spoke his vows, his voice carried none of the practiced confidence he had once brought to every room he entered, replaced instead by something far more valuable, a genuine and humble devotion, earned slowly across a year of honest effort. Eleanor's own vows, spoken with the same unshaken composure that had carried her through every hardship since her father's passing, promised not submission or gratitude, but partnership, freely chosen, and fiercely intended to be honored. As the small gathering celebrated late into the summer evening, Eleanor found a quiet moment to stand alone at the edge of Belmont's restored fields, watching the sun set golden over land that was entirely, undeniably her own, now joined by choice rather than necessity to a man who had learned, through genuine effort and hard-won humility, to stand beside her as an equal rather than above her. Edmund found her there a short while later, and together they watched the last light fade over the fields she had rebuilt from ruin, two people who had begun their story in cruelty and misunderstanding, and who now stood together on ground earned entirely through honesty, patience, and the quiet, unshakable strength of a woman who had refused, from the very first terrible evening, to let anyone else determine her worth. 3 years after their wedding at Belmont, the estate at Ashford stood transformed in ways few who remembered its earlier grandeur would have predicted. Eleanor's steady hand, applied with the same discipline that had rebuilt her own family's fortune, had guided Ashford's finances out of the quiet crisis Edmund's father had left behind, tenant by tenant, ledger by ledger, until the estate stood on foundations far sturdier than the glittering surface it had once presented to the world. It was on a bright autumn morning, with the leaves at Ashford turning gold along the same drive where Eleanor had once walked out alone into the cold night, that a carriage arrived carrying an unexpected visitor. Lord Frederick Ashcombe, the very man who had once attempted to embarrass Edmund publicly at Margaret's second dinner, stepped down looking considerably diminished from the confident figure he had once been, his own estate having suffered significant losses through poor management he had been too proud to address in time. Nathaniel the butler announced him with visible surprise, and Edmund met him in the same great hall where their old rivalry had once played out so publicly. Eleanor joined them a moment later, her expression carefully neutral, though Edmund caught the flicker of curiosity behind her composed manner. "I have come," Ashcombe said stiffly, clearly finding the words difficult, "to ask for guidance. My own estate faces difficulties I no longer know how to correct, and I understand, from considerable and rather humbling gossip, that the Duchess of Ashford has become quite renowned for exactly this kind of restoration. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, remembering clearly the petty cruelty he had once attempted to inflict at her expense. She might easily have refused him, might have allowed him to feel the same sting of dismissal he had once tried to deliver to her and Edmund both. Instead, she found herself considering the tenant families who depended on Ashcombe's estate, families who bore no responsibility for their lord's poor judgment and would suffer most directly from his continued mismanagement. "I will offer what guidance I can," she said finally, "not for your sake, Lord Ashcombe, but for the sake of the families whose livelihoods depend on your estate's recovery. I trust you will receive that guidance with more grace than you once extended to us." Ashcombe had the decency to look genuinely humbled. "I will, your grace, and I confess, watching what you have built here, alongside the Duke, has taught me a considerable amount about the difference between inherited pride and earned respect." Over the following months, Eleanor traveled periodically to Ashcombe's estate, applying the same careful methods that had restored both Belmont and Ashford, teaching Ashcombe's steward the discipline of honest accounting and fair tenant management that she had learned through her own family's painful lessons. It was not friendship that grew between Eleanor and Ashcombe, but something more valuable in its own way, a grudging mutual respect built on demonstrated competence rather than inherited standing. Closer to home, life at Ashford had settled into a rhythm neither Edmund nor Eleanor could have imagined on that first terrible evening. Their days were filled with the practical work of managing two thriving estates, evenings spent in comfortable partnership reviewing ledgers and tenant reports, discussing decisions as true equals in exactly the manner Eleanor had insisted upon from the very beginning of their courtship. Margaret visited often, delighting in watching the friendship and partnership between her cousin and the Duke deepen with each passing season, and it was during one such visit that she brought news that stirred old memories neither Edmund nor Eleanor had entirely set aside. "I have received word," Margaret said carefully over tea one afternoon, "that several families who once whispered so cruelly about your circumstances, Eleanor, now speak of you as the model of what proper estate management ought to look like. It seems your reputation has traveled considerably further than even I anticipated." Eleanor accepted this news with the same measured composure she brought to everything, though a small, satisfied smile touched her lips. "I take no particular pleasure in their changed opinion, Margaret. I built what I built for myself and for the families who depend on me, not to win the approval of people who once judged me so unfairly." "And yet," Edmund observed gently, "there is no shame in acknowledging that their changed opinion reflects something true about the character you have always possessed, whether they recognized it that first evening or not." Eleanor considered this, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps that is fair. Though I confess, the opinion I value most has never been theirs to give." "Whose then?" Margaret asked, though her knowing smile suggested she already understood the answer. Eleanor glanced at Edmund, warmth entering her expression in a way that still, after 3 years, caught him slightly by surprise with its steady sincerity. "My own, first and always, and his, which he has earned through considerably more effort than most men would have troubled themselves to spend." That winter, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Grace, born during a heavy snowfall not unlike the one that had first brought Edmund to Belmont's door seeking her forgiveness. Charlotte, now a doting grandmother, insisted the child possessed her mother's steady eyes from the very first day, a claim Edmund found himself entirely unable to dispute as he watched his daughter's calm, curious gaze, taking in the world around her. Beatrice, still cherished within the Ashford household and now overseeing the kitchens with well-earned authority, prepared a special dinner to celebrate Grace's arrival, and it was during that quiet family celebration that Eleanor found a private moment to reflect with Edmund on how far they had traveled since that first terrible evening. "Do you ever think of it still?" she asked him, cradling their daughter by the fire. "That first dinner?" "Every year on its anniversary," Edmund admitted, "not with the shame I once carried, though that has never fully disappeared, but with gratitude for the lesson it forced upon me, however painfully delivered." "I think of it too," Eleanor said, "though I have come to see it differently than I once did. That evening broke something in me that needed breaking, an old assumption that my worth depended on how others chose to seat me at their tables. I do not think I would have found the strength to rebuild everything I have, without first losing the comfortable illusion that such things mattered as much as I once believed." Edmund reached over to take her hand, watching their daughter's small fingers curl instinctively around Eleanor's own. "Then perhaps, in some strange way, I gave you a gift that terrible evening, though I certainly never intended it as one." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine in the quiet room. "I would not go quite so far as calling it a gift, Edmund, but I have made my peace with it. and more than my peace. I have built, from that single cruel evening, a life I am genuinely proud to call my own, alongside a partner I have come, fully and without reservation, to love. Outside, snow continued falling gently over Ashford's grounds, the same grounds Eleanor had once walked alone into the cold night, dignity intact but future uncertain. Now those same grounds sheltered a family built on honesty, resilience, and hard-won mutual respect, a testament to the truth Eleanor had carried with her from that very first terrible evening, that a person's worth was never determined by where others chose to seat them, but by the quiet, unshakable strength with which they carried themselves regardless, and by the life they built, deliberately and honestly, once given the chance to rebuild it entirely on their own terms. Oliver Bellamy visited that spring with his new wife, a bright and warm-hearted woman named Charlotte's goddaughter, whom he had met through a mutual acquaintance not long after his conversation with Eleanor in London. Watching Oliver's genuine happiness, unclouded now by old, unspoken longing, brought Eleanor a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with guilt, and everything to do with relief for a friend she cherished deeply. "You look well, Oliver," Eleanor told him as they walked together through Belmont's gardens, their spouses following a short distance behind. Deep and easy conversation about estate management neither had expected to find common ground on so readily. "I am well," Oliver said, smiling. "Better than well. I owe you a debt for pushing me, however gently, toward being honest with myself about what I truly wanted." "You owe me nothing," Eleanor replied. "I am simply glad to see you happy, truly and fully." Their friendship, tested by old unspoken feelings and ultimately strengthened by honest conversation, remained one of the steadiest threads running through Eleanor's life in the years that followed. A reminder that not every difficult conversation ended in loss, that honesty, however uncomfortable in the moment, often cleared the way toward something considerably more lasting than the alternative. Nathaniel Fairweather, too, remained a steady presence in their lives, visiting Belmont often to walk the fields he had once feared his niece might never reclaim, watching with quiet pride as the Tennant families continued to thrive under her careful stewardship. He had, in his own quiet way, become something of a grandfather figure to Grace, delighting in her early attempts at walking through the same gardens where her mother had once found the courage to rebuild an entire family's fortune from nothing more than a single overlooked letter and an unshakable will. Even Margaret, who had carried guilt over that first terrible evening for far longer than either Edmund or Eleanor ever wished her to, eventually found peace with the memory, coming to see it not as her own failure, but as the unlikely beginning of a story that had ultimately brought her cousin more happiness and security than she might otherwise have found. She remained a constant presence at both Ashford and Belmont, her friendship with Eleanor deepening year by year into something closer to true sisterhood. Grace grew, in the years that followed, into a child who inherited her mother's steady composure and her father's hard-won humility in equal measure, raised in a household where kindness toward every person, regardless of fortune or standing, was never treated as optional courtesy, but as the very foundation upon which Ashford's renewed prosperity had been built. And on the rare occasions when guests gathered once more in the great hall where the story had first begun, no one, staff or nobility alike, was ever again seated according to anything other than the simple, unwavering principle that every person at Ashford's table deserved to be treated with dignity, a lesson the Duke and Duchess had learned together, at considerable cost, and had chosen, ever after, never to forget.